I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Balancing the broad needs of the city with those of a neighborhood or a specific group is the art of governing. One of the people who does this the best is Gale Brewer, my borough president of Manhattan, and she's the borough president of Manhattan, and she's my guest today. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, Ronnie.
Oh, it's very nice. So the mayor, this is what I want to talk to you about. The mayor has announced this broad plan to create 200,000 units of housing over the next 10 years. So he needs to protect housing that's already existing, and he needs to get new housing, right? So now, to protect housing that's already existing, he's got this stuff going on in Albany. And we all know Albany is in a state of, I would assume, some kind of chaos. It's really terrible, isn't it?
It does seem terrible. I mean, he's planning for...
I mean, I'm just now talking about Albany.
No, Albany's a mess. I'm glad I'm not there.
Yeah.
And the people who are there are trying to make some sense of it all.
It's just
we all love Liz Kruger.
Yeah.
And I know she's
Definitely.
the one I rely on, along
Yeah.
with Assemblymember Brian Kavanaugh for info.
Yeah.
But it seems like a mess.
Yeah. All right. So the mayor's got at least two important things, but I guess there are like 4 or 5 things that are all going to expire this June.
Correct. He's got destabilization and 421A.
Right. Now, destabilization means that what?
Well, what happens is that the stabilization, there are over 1 million rent-regulated tenants in the city of New York. And then the question is, in Albany, they decide whether it continues and how it continues and if it continues. And obviously, to keep the 1 million preserved units, if that's the way you want to describe it in terms of rent-regulated.
As affordable.
As affordable. They are affordable. Those are rent-regulated. Yeah. Then you need to pass legislation in Albany that does 2 things. One, you want to keep at least what we have, hopefully that. But in addition, you want to get rid of what we call vacancy decontrol, which destabilizes if your rent is more than $2,500 a month, and if you make over $200,000 a year in a 2-year period, and if the apartment becomes vacant, then the landlord can also jack up the rent. Right. And that would be great to get rid of. Right. And then we would be able to continue
to protect.
To protect. So that is part of the mayor's request.
The other one is J51.
Well, the other one is 421A.
Well, I'm going to come to that later.
Okay.
That's the big one.
Right.
But a little one also is J51.
J51.
Which this also affects saving, doesn't it?
Correct. In other words, there is an issue where you renovate the systems. It could be the electrical, the boiler, but there's always a throw-in, particularly, trying to get issues that we think are not necessarily eligible. Sometimes that gets thrown in, and then you have a tax abatement. But in the same time, you renovate the buildings, and often for market tenants, and the rent goes up.
Right.
And you get a deduction. You get a rent abatement for a unit that might have been rent regulated in the past.
Yeah. And then we have the condo and co-op abatement, which people get, which is also going to...
The 3-year abatement.
But the most important one is the 421A.
Correct.
Which not only affects renters, I guess, but it also affects co-ops and basically condos. Right. Yeah. And that has a direct effect then on our land use and the mayor's land policy, right?
My understanding in Albany is obviously what 421A does currently, it's a bust. It's horrible. It's $1 billion of money that we could have been used for something else. Condos have gotten it, where they're all luxury. And of course, when we do have a 421A, when there's some affordable, it's very little. And sometimes on top of it, the owners get more floor area ratio, so they get to both go up further and get a tax abatement, and just a small amount of...
and they have to, in some places, well, is it all over the place that they have to give 20% of the apartments they're building affordable?
What happens is, in some cases, other than the central business district, they can actually just get a 421A and not have any affordable.
How does that happen?
Well, it happens, but unfortunately, deals made in Albany. That's happened in a couple of instances. Or we just don't even know exactly where the affordable is. It's certainly not on site.
Yeah.
So 421A has been abused. We hear about 157 on 57th Street.
I still don't understand. That was just a deal.
That was a deal. And there were 5 buildings in that deal. And so that was the example that I just gave.
It covered all his buildings. 5 of his buildings?
No, 5 different owners, I believe.
Oh, I see.
But the fact of the matter is that's the deal that I just described. Yeah. We don't even know exactly where the affordable is, but these large, expensive condos got a 421A.
Right. So what do we want to do about 421?
Well,
the mayor wants to change it.
We all want to change. We either want
Well, everybody wants to change it.
Everybody wants to change it. I don't know if the Republicans want to change it, and
Yeah.
I don't know if the real estate industry wants to change it, but all the rest of us want to change it. And the mayor has a proposal to put affordable units as a mandate if you get 421A. I don't know, I'm sure it'll be part of a deal with the rent regulation that we just talked about. I'm not in Albany, so I don't know all the deals that are being contemplated.
But what does it mean? What's the mayor want to do? He wants to up the number of affordable units?
He wants to up the number of affordable units. If you get 421A, it would be mandated.
On site?
On site.
Right. Any place in the city?
Correct. But, the issue is always how much. 25%, I believe, is what he's considering. I think some of us would like even more than that, particularly in areas that are very high income. And then there's the issue is, should it go for condos or just rentals, and all those kinds of issues also. There's a lot to be discussed.
And if it goes for rentals, do they become stabilized apartments?
They do during the time period of the 421A, but in some instances, it's never been clear what happens when the abatement leaves or ends.
And then we have, is the poor door, is that part of that?
That's more and part of the inclusionary zoning issue, but these are all related. The issue with the poor door has been the mandatory inclusionary zoning, which has been voluntary. So places
So
like...
we're going to come to that.
We'll come to that.
So the mayor has to pay a lot of attention to Albany
Yes.
to try to get these things all happen. But in his own city,
Yes.
he's listed 4 points, right? 1 is to make the system easier to build.
Yes.
2 is to make the buildings supposedly prettier.
Well, pretty or sustainable, supposedly
Yeah.
green, I guess you call it. Yep.
And then housing for elderly.
Housing, 10,000 units for housing for elderly.
And then what's the last one?
Well, he wants to make sure they're affordable. I mean,
Right.
supposedly.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about this text change that they're proposing.
There are like different aspects that he wants to create, because he's got this 200,000 unit goal. He's got 120,000 in preservation that we just talked about a little bit. And then he has the issue of neighborhood zonings and then the text change. Those are 2 aspects of it. And then we can talk about the inclusionary zoning. So the neighborhood rezonings, which would be in Manhattan, as part of this 80,000, it's upzoning. That's how, in his mind, you get to the 80,000 in all the boroughs. But in Manhattan, he's focused on East Harlem and parts of Inwood.
And what does upzoning mean?
Upzoning means that the buildings would be taller than what the zoning currently calls for. For instance, if you have a what we call taxpayer, meaning a small store that is low rise, maybe 2 stories, should you, that's the question, change the zoning so that it is 13 stories? I'm making up numbers now. So in East Harlem and in Inwood, we have just begun with the local elected officials and the city agencies and the community boards series of roundtable discussions and meetings to plan. So there'll be people breaking up into groups and so on. So those are what I call the new housing, part of the new housing proposal. That's in his mind. And I think we've read in the papers recently that East New York and Brooklyn is starting their process.
And that can contribute to changing the character of a neighborhood.
Because you and I know the West Side so well, we know what's happened on the West Side in terms of gentrification, it makes me nervous. I always worry about the retail also. We want to keep our mom and pop stores and not end up with chain stores in this new housing. Yes, I would say this is a slippery slope, but if there is a great deal of input from the community, who knows? Yeah. I'm saying that's the goal.
Does this also change the mid-block?
Up to the whole, I mean, I'm not a supporter of building tall buildings in mid-block, but all of this is being discussed in East Harlem and in Inwood. Inwood had its first meeting very recently, and East Harlem has had a couple of meetings.
And Inwood has more or less low buildings.
Inwood has low buildings, and they have the rail yards.
Yeah. And this is also in other parts of the city.
Definitely. There are apparently 15, I believe, neighborhoods where this is being contemplated.
Right. And once it starts there,
well,
it can spread all over.
Well, I believe that the new housing is being proposed in those 2 neighborhoods in terms of upzoning. And where he is planning upzoning, again, this is still planning. He's also talking about bringing in legal aid for the preservation aspect. You know as well as I do, when a new building comes into the neighborhood, the other buildings suffer. At least that's how I would look at it in terms of support. So, and in addition, he's talking about putting more capital money into neighborhoods where there will be affordable housing. But again, big question mark.
What does that mean? Transportation?
You need transportation,
Schools.
you need schools, you need to think about, the retail, you need to think about all the infrastructure issues.
So
water,
it's creating
sewer.
new communities, essentially.
Well, these communities exist.
Yeah.
The question is, what's next door?
Yeah.
What's next door?
So it puts an enormous weight on the community boards or on the neighborhood, the people
Absolutely,
in the community.
to come up with the right plan if this is all going to happen.
And we all know how complicated this is because the city planning is a very complicated thing. I mean,
Very.
who knows what FAR is and what this is and
That's
that
why I
is.
try to talk exactly in floor area
Yeah,
ratio, not
yeah.
use some of the acronyms. You're absolutely, it's very complicated.
And there are, the department has all kinds of requirements and procedures. We have the whole ULURP process. This would have to go through ULURP?
This will all go through ULURP.
The whole,
Absolutely.
as a plan or as each neighborhood?
Well, that's a good question. When I talk about the contextual zoning, I'll describe that situation. But the neighborhood would be an individual ULURP.
Mm-hmm. I see.
But it's complicated ULURP. It's one thing to do, an area around, 10 blocks. It's another thing to do a whole community.
Yeah. And so anybody really trying to meaningfully contribute to any of this needs to have legal counsel.
Well, I think certainly in terms of there are attorneys who, there's two ways. You need attorneys to be part of the steering committee, so working in East Harlem and Inwood, yes. And also we need to have really good lawyers supporting the tenants who live there, absolutely. And legal aid will help. I also worry about those who don't qualify for legal aid.
When they say legal aid, they mean legal
services, legal services.
But how can they do that when they're already overworked?
They're going to supposedly get more money. This is
I
all,
see.
again, part of this, where there's neighborhood rezonings. Supposedly that's all going to be part of the package. Again, I'm just telling you what I'm been told is happening. I've been at all these meetings, and so I'm going to be at all these meetings.
And all the borough presidents too?
The borough presidents in each borough are participating, as I understand it, in the discussions, yes.
Are they as interested as you?
I think I like my other 4 borough presidents. We have fun together.
Oh, good.
We have a good time, actually.
Yeah.
We get along really well. We have dinner pretty regularly.
Oh, good. So that's a very good thing because then you find the commonality between you.
Exactly. And the other issue, but you mentioned, is this contextual zoning.
Yes,
though.
let's talk about
and
that.
And the borough presidents are concerned about that.
Yeah.
Because that's a little bit different.
What does that mean?
Well, that is a
What
little
is
bit more.
contextual
It's
zoning?
Contextual zoning is what we mostly have in Manhattan. You have the mid-zone, mid-block zone, as you just described. Yeah. You have the avenue, right, zoning. So west side, east side, downtown and uptown in Manhattan and elsewhere, all around the boroughs, people, community boards, elected officials, they spend a lot of time figuring out, okay, this is what should be here, and this is what should be there, and this is a historic district. All of that is contextual. That's what it really is.
So how do we get these enormously high buildings?
Well, the issue with this, in terms of what he's proposing for this, that's just what this I am concerned about. And we did, because what he wants to do here is to say that in certain circumstances, an owner of a building can make it a little bit taller. But hello, we've just spent, 20, 30 years, you tell me, working on all these zonings. So all of a sudden you're just going to do a blanket text amendment to be able to give people the opportunity to be a little bit, 15 feet taller. Maybe you're bulkier on the bottom. We don't like that. I have to be honest with you. So we wrote with almost all the elected officials in Manhattan, a really long letter. We got all the elected officials in Manhattan to sign on. A couple didn't, but most of them did, and said, slow it down to City Planning Commission. Slow it down. We had about 100 people at the hearing to testify against a general text amendment to the whole city of New York, right, stating that you can do this change that would basically state that there could be a slightly larger building in many of these neighborhoods that already have a certain type of zoning.
And is it tied to something? Do you have to give
You would
something
have,
if
the
you're gonna
owners
build
would
it?
build affordable housing, but when you're living in a building that might have rent-regulated tenants, it's not, why are you giving up the rent-regulated buildings to build affordable housing when you already have affordable housing that's supposed to be preserved? So in Manhattan in particular, 11 of the 12 community boards really have a lot of contextual zoning that we feel should not be undone.
It's the contextual zoning is the one that if you have a row of brownstones,
Correct.
you could still, in the middle of the block,
Right.
build a taller building.
Well, under his proposal.
Yeah.
But we are not, we'd like to see a lot more discussion of how that could possibly happen.
But how now? Explain now how 1 West 57th or the one on Park Avenue, how did they get built?
That's another discussion and something that we're working on. So frustrating. So that is what we call really non-transparent lot mergers. In other words, he bought meaning Mr.
I see,
Excel, Gary Barnett, bought lots, he found people who were willing to sell on 57th Street, and then he bought the air rights from nearby low-rise buildings. Now, it is hard for people to understand that you can pay for air.
Right.
The issue that
you can buy air.
That you can buy air. So what we're looking at, we can introduce legislation with the City Council. We've been doing so. And one of the issues we want to look at is if you're going to buy air, for lack of it's hard to understand that, but you do buy air in this city. And if you're going to be able to buy a lot that could enable you to go so tall, then at least it should be information, should be transparent to the public. Community Board 5, which is an excellent community board, had no idea on 57th Street that all of this was taking place. We lost the Rizzoli bookstore,
right.
And we also could end up with shadows in Central Park.
Rizzoli is going to be the really tallest one?
Rizzoli is going to be
I don't know,
one of the taller buildings.
Yeah.
And all of that is going to cast shadows over Central Park.
And you also, though, don't have to buy a lot to buy the air rights.
No, you don't. But
like the Art Students League.
You don't have to buy it a lot, but they often do. And the reason I mention it is there's no information available to the public when that lot is purchased. That's what we're asking for. We can't say you can't buy the lot, but we can say the public should know about it, and the public should know about air being transferred.
And should it go through ULER?
Well, it at least should be available for the public to know that it's happening.
And we worry then about landmarks?
Well, that's another whole, absolutely. The landmark law, that's a complicated situation because a lot of churches and synagogues and faith-based and nonprofits that are landmark love to sell their air rights.
Right.
On 57th Street, Calvary Baptist Church is, I think, unfortunately, selling their air rights because then they survive in their mission. At the same time, we end up with a tall building. These are really hard issues to decipher. Very complicated because you don't want the churches to be sold for demolition, but at the same time, you want them to survive. The Calvary Church is unfortunately not a landmark, but it is
and the Board
selling
of
its air
Education
rights.
Can sell.
We stopped the Department of Education selling air rights over PS 191 and 199, but we always worry that could happen. Absolutely.
So this simple plan is really a very complicated plan.
It's a very complicated plan. And you also have the issue of inclusionary housing, because right now, as we know from the area around the Hudson River on 61st Street, the owners of buildings can get to go up taller, FAR as we call it, floor area ratio. All that means is you go taller, if they put in some on-site or off-site affordable housing. It's voluntary. They obviously get to go up higher, and they have to provide some affordable housing, 20%. The mayor wants to say that where you have his upzoning, where we talked about East Harlem or Inwood or East New York, that if they go up taller, then they have to provide mandatory on-site affordable housing. However, in the other parts of Manhattan, which is everywhere but East Harlem and Inwood, we should have it be mandatory also, not voluntary, and we want more. So this whole issue of inclusionary zoning, all that means is affordable housing included in the project. So we think it should be baked into the zoning. Then you don't end up with this two-door situation or the double dipping with 421A, which is often what they do.
Also,
so these are all issues that are
complicated. The whole
complicated.
controversy in a building that has affordable housing in a luxury building, whether those people can share in the amenities that the building has.
It's a huge issue. We learned it the hard way.
How many years is it going to take to get this through this?
I think, according to the mayor, he wants to do some of his neighborhood rezonings and what we talked about, this I call it contextual rezoning, because I don't know what else to call it. He wants to have it done within a year. So, in terms of starting.
Has he actually proposed a proposal that's going to start a ULER process?
Well, the rezoning for the contextual has been delayed by us. And so that is not going to be started. I don't know if that's the actual date in September. Again, it's been delayed till September. And then these other neighborhood rezonings that I talked about, at least in Manhattan, I don't know elsewhere, there'll be at least a year, maybe more, of these neighborhood meetings that I talked about. So those are the two that have some life in terms of discussion.
And then eventually they'll go to community boards, back to the City Planning Commission, and eventually to the City Council.
And the borough president is in there,
And
too.
the borough, I'm sorry, very importantly.
Because I think we're trying to bring people
Yeah.
together
Yeah.
and do some of this. You know, we're trying to say we've been doing this on other projects like East Midtown and the South Street Seaport, Lenox Terrace, trying to bring people together early. Because when you hit, as you know, the community board with you got just a couple of months to make a decision. It's hard on these. Look how complicated this is.
It's very incredible.
So complicated.
Yeah. So you have a whole land use staff.
We have a wonderful land use staff.
That's good.
And they're assigned to different community boards to work on these issues.
And you also now, just for a minute, have a project where you're visiting every community board.
We're visiting every community board and every community district, walking around, and I try to go to as many of them as possible. I have a lot of respect for them. We try to appoint, some good people, and they're working hard.
Let's talk about one of your long-term interests, and I think passions, is commercial rent protection.
Yep.
How many years do you think you've been working on this?
Well, when I worked for Ruth, that was 1980s.
Ruth Messenger,
Yes,
right?
Ruth Messenger. That was the 1980s, and we proposed a bill to discuss those issues. Then we lost. I think when we lost, wasn't it Grossinger's Bakery on 86th Street?
Yes, right. That's right. Because,
Herb Grossinger.
right. With a rent renewal.
Right. He lost his lease, and that was everyone's, including my favorite bakery in the whole world. And when that went, I think that's when we started this issue. And unfortunately, it has not changed. The same issues are current today.
So now what can we do about it? Because it keeps... What is the pressure that stops any kind of change?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues that are even more challenging today. When I was in the council, after your great leadership, we passed a West Side zoning law for commercials because I couldn't think of what else to do. But we ended up with banks can only be on Broadway, Amsterdam, and Columbus. They can only be 25 feet long in a 200-foot streetscape. And these drugstores, et cetera, or any new store can only be 40 feet long on Amsterdam and Columbus. So that helps a little bit. I wasn't able to deal with rent per se, but I got that through the Bloomberg administration. So that's one way to handle this is zoning. On the other hand, there are already like 70 banks on the west side. Who needs 70 banks? Oh,
There's a corner where there's a bank on every corner.
on 55th Street.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
It's unbelievable. The only thing left is Alvin Ailey on the corner.
Right.
And then there's 3 banks.
Yeah.
9th Avenue and 55th Street. It's horrible. But so now we're trying, so we introduced legislation. We're going to be introducing legislation that is hopefully has the goal of passage, because the bill that Ruth introduced many years ago has been pending since 1985, and that's a long time. It hasn't passed.
Was that an equivalent of rent stabilization, or?
It would basically say that if the landlord and the tenant, that they're mandated to come together with an arbitrator, and the arbitrator will say the rent should be X. But I don't know that you could legally
Force
do
somebody
that.
into arbitration?
So that's what we're trying. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a gray area.
Yeah.
What we're saying is, let's just get started with the following on the rent issues. We would like to have a mediator, and if the two cannot work it out, but they have to come to the table. If they can't work it out, then at least you'd have another year as the commercial tenant with a slight increase. At least you have something. Right now, the stationery store on 108th Street, West Side Stationers, which I love, they were given like 3 weeks, and they've been there 32 years.
That's incredible, isn't it?
So you hear these stories all the time.
Now, would this cover retail space in any building?
Shop, all the ones who are storefronters, as we call them, people who
Right.
have commercials on the street,
Right.
in
Isn't it?
particular.
So, but especially in subsidized housing, are there any special regulations now in place in
Not
subsidized housing?
that I know of. One of the challenges is that we've learned since 1985 is the chains have come in, and there was a report done by Jonathan Bowles at the Center for Urban Futures on the huge number of chains in the city of New York. And I must admit, I think that when there are too many, you lose the feeling.
Lose all those independent, wonderful,
Yes.
different stores.
And otherwise, why do we live in New York? They are the heart and soul of our
And you
city.
go to any major city and you see the same
Exactly.
thing.
So
losing all our distinctions.
So I'm trying to figure a way to have a curtailment on the chains where there are already a balance and not an imbalance on the chains. And that's why we need the mom and pops. So this particular law would apply to any store, not up on the 20th floor of an office building, but on this what we call storefronters. We also have other ideas. We want to help stores condo, in other words, to be a condo space. And there are federal funds available to purchase your space. And then we're also trying to think, obviously we're working on the fines and fees, which the mayor's working on, so they're not too onerous. We have to think of everything we can to support the mom and pops. But the number one issue and challenge is the rent.
Some of the buildings that are built as condominiums, the sponsor retains the commercial space.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I've seen it.
And even when they have 80-20 or anything else, they're still
I know that
deriving the income.
I know several senior buildings that are senior buildings above affordable, very low income actually, and the sponsor continues. So this is as complicated as the affordable housing issue is. The retail is equally, but I think people are so upset with this now that hopefully we can get something passed in the city council.
That's great. Now you as a borough president can introduce legislation?
We can introduce it with members of the city council. We can do it together. I think we've introduced about 46 bills, and we've passed quite a few. So we really enjoy working with my former colleagues.
That's very good. Do you find the same issue in other boroughs?
The commercial rent, I've always found less so, because there are still avenues where there's a great deal of commercial diversification and diverse mom and pop and the hat stores and the bodegas. But the affordable issues are now cropping up in terms of housing.
Thank you, Gail, for trying to show us the complexity of this whole thing. And being so complex, I hope you will come back again as we get to each stage so we can get people to really know what's happening.
I would love to come back, Ronnie.
Right. Thank you, Madam Borough President.
Thank you very much, Ronnie Eldridge, Honorable.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.